Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back into a time when childhood fun was, let's just say, not exactly designed by safety inspectors. So, if you've dimmed the lights, tucked yourself in, and maybe grabbed a blanket fort of your own, we can drift into the world of medieval children's games. Spoiler alert, they often looked more like boot camp, or in some cases, a light medieval torture session, than anything resembling play. But then again, if you lived in the Middle Ages, fun was kind of a loose concept anyway. So, picture this. It's a chilly morning in a muddy medieval village. Kids are running around barefoot because shoes were either a luxury or, if you did have them, more trouble than they were worth. And what's the first game on the agenda? Oh, just a little classic called Hoodman Blind. We know it today as Blind Man's Bluff. The idea is simple. One kid gets blindfolded, usually with an old sack thrown over their head, and then they stagger around trying to catch someone else. Sounds fine, right? Except back then, the sack was often tied so tightly you could barely breathe, and kids delighted in pushing the blindfolded victim into walls, mud puddles, or, the occasional livestock pen. So, fun and suffocation all in one. And this wasn't a gentle game. Remember, medieval kids had no TikTok, no Mario Kart, just pent-up energy from hauling water buckets or turning spits in kitchens. So they played rough. Accounts describe children laughing hysterically as the hoodmen stumbled into furniture, or occasionally whacked themselves on low beams. Honestly, if you imagine a group of kids chanting while one slowly suffocates in a bag, you might think you've stumbled into a budget horror film. But no, this was just Tuesday. Now, if that one wasn't lively enough, there was hot cockles. This was the medieval version of, let's beat up our friends for sport. One child would kneel down, put their head in another's lap, already a weird start, and then they'd place their hands behind them. The others would take turns slapping those hands as hard as possible, while the kneeling child had to guess who struck them. If they guessed wrong, the slapping just continued. So basically, a game of physical pain disguised as guessing practice. Imagine parents watching and thinking, yes, excellent, this will toughen them up for adulthood. No wonder so many knights grew up oddly aggressive. Speaking of toughness, medieval kids loved games of endurance. One of the more disturbing ones was just called fisticuffs, which, yes, is exactly what it sounds like. Children punching each other in the face, often in front of cheering peers. No protective gloves, no referees, just little nobles and peasants swinging until someone cried. It was supposed to build character. I suppose it did, along with missing teeth. But not everything was violent. Sometimes the games were just weird. Take apple bobbing. We still do this today at Halloween, but medieval apple bobbing wasn't a festive autumn pastime. Instead of just apples, sometimes they'd float small coins or even hot coals in the water to make it more exciting. The idea was to test not just your dexterity, but your courage. Because nothing screams childhood fun like accidentally setting your face on fire for a silver penny. And let's not forget the animal-based games. Medieval kids loved to mess with chickens. One game, rather disturbingly, was called cockshy. A live rooster would be tied to a post, and children would take turns throwing sticks or stones at it. Whoever managed to kill it first got to keep the bird for dinner. And yes, that technically counts as both play and food prep. Imagine explaining to a child today, we're not going to chuck cheese. We're going to tie up a chicken and practice our aim. Different times. Another animal favorite was pig bladder ball. This was basically the ancestor of soccer. But instead of a shiny Adidas ball, you inflated a pig's bladder. Yes, the organ, tied it off and kicked it around the street. Sometimes it was greased to make it slippery because why not double down on grossness? It smelled terrible. But hey, it was light and bouncy. The kids didn't mind. Adults even joined in, and games could go on for hours, occasionally ending with broken windows, cracked skulls, and entire villages feuding over who actually won. So, basically, medieval soccer had the same amount of chaos as modern soccer, but with more bodily fluids. Let's float over to another oddly painful pastime, tip cat. A stick was placed on the ground, carved to have pointed ends. One child used a bigger stick to flip it into the air and then smack it as far as possible. Sounds simple, Except when the stick came back down, kids often got smacked in the head, or the sharp little ends hit someone in the eye. There are records of serious injuries from this charming childhood pastime, but at least no one was set on fire. Small victories. Now here's the fun twist. Nobles, even royal children, played many of these games. You'd think princes and princesses would get gentler pastimes. Nope, they bobbed for apples, punched each other, and rolled pig bladders too. Because nothing says future ruler of France like running around with mud in your teeth and possibly a concussion from Tip-Cat. Now that we're thoroughly bruised, let's drift into the slightly more structured side of medieval childhood fun, games that doubled as, well, training for adulthood. Because let's face it, if you were a medieval child, your life was basically a dress rehearsal for either farm work or battlefield duty. For noble boys, that meant mock jousting. But don't imagine shiny little lances and ponies. No, young squires would grab wooden poles and ride barrels, or sometimes each other, slamming into their playmates as hard as they could. Broken noses were common. But hey, nothing says bonding like knocking your friend unconscious. It was seen as perfectly normal and even educational. If you survived childhood games, congratulations, you were qualified for medieval adulthood. And then there were wrestling matches. These weren't gentle. Kids wrestled in dirt, on cobblestones, or in castle halls with no mats or soft grass. Bones snapped, but parents approved. After all, if you were going to grow up to fight in the 100 Years' War, a dislocated shoulder in childhood was just practice. Girls had games too, but theirs were equally odd. They often played hobby horse, galloping around with sticks between their legs, which sounds innocent until you remember this was supposed to prepare them for managing livestock, or, metaphorically, husbands. Other times, they'd practice spinning contests or weaving races. Imagine being 6 years old and your game is who can spin wool the fastest. Childhood joy, medieval edition. But sometimes boys and girls played together. A popular pastime was leapfrog. Yes, the same one we know today. Except instead of safe playground surfaces, it was played on hard-packed dirt, full of stones and debris. Scraped knees were basically the uniform of medieval childhood. Another favorite was King of the Hill. A pile of rocks or a haystack would do, and kids shoved each other until someone reigned supreme at the top. Bruises included. And of course, there was singing and dancing. But even these weren't exactly gentle. Ring Around the Rosie, for example, dates back centuries, possibly connected to plague imagery. Nothing says fun like chanting about roses and ashes while holding hands in a disease-ridden world, and then collapsing dramatically at the end, always the crowd pleaser. By the way, some of these games made their way up to the royal nursery. Chronicles mention young Edward III playing ball games with his squires, and even Louis XIV's court children rolling hoops and pig bladders through Versailles gardens. Imagine the Sun King's heirs chasing a squeaky bladder across the lawn. Very dignified. So what's the takeaway? Well, medieval children didn't exactly play gently. Their fun involved smacking, choking, scraping, and occasionally animal cruelty. But for them, it wasn't strange. It was just life. If you wanted to grow up strong enough to survive plague, famine, and your neighbor's poorly aimed crossbow, then childhood needed to be its own kind of trial. So tonight, as you drift off, you can be thankful that your childhood games probably involve board games, playground swings, or maybe some mildly competitive Mario Kart. Not suffocation in a sack, not apple bobbing with hot coals, and definitely not pig bladders. Sleep well and maybe dream of gentler playgrounds.